The Headless Woman. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, I thought for a child my age that I'd been rather fearless. That's a silly notion, even if you view it through the lens of everything being relative. Why does this matter, you ask? Because one of the most vivid moments of my life came about during a quiet night in the middle of a school week. My dad worked nights as a truck driver and had done so for many years by that time, so he usually had very interesting stories to tell me. He once told me about how scary it was to drive his truck through Gary, Indiana, in the middle of the night, and he was not one to scare easily, which is relevant to this story. Being the boy who liked to hang out around his dad, I slept in the same bed as he did that night, and we talked for what seemed like hours. I had trouble sleeping as a boy, so usually this helped me go to sleep. My bedroom had a closet, and in that closet was the entrance to the attic space. I used to have fears of things popping out of the closet and frightening me, although it never happened. I finally grew out of this phase, and this thought popped into my mind that night. I distinctly remember telling my dad, word for word, "Dad, I'm so glad that ghosts aren't real." He didn't hesitate. "Oh yes they are, boy, and you'd be smart not to fool around with that stuff," he told me in the most serious voice I'd ever heard from him. My life changed that day, because I never had any reason to doubt my dad. He wasn't one to make this sort of thing up. He had me curious, and at first I did try to cast my doubt, but he persisted and told me his story. In 1978, a year before he and my mom married, Mom rented an apartment in the city of Fort Wayne, Indiana. I even know the street name, and I know the house. The apartment was on the second story, and the landlady was quite aged by that time, well into her 80s. When my mom moved in, the old lady told Mom that her sister passed away in the house, and that was why there was crucifixes on every wall, no matter where you turned. Laundry was done in the basement, and she refused to let anyone go down into the basement alone. According to Mom and Dad, the basement was a creepy place where one kept hearing noises, never mind the noises of the gas furnace or air traveling through the pipes. Over the period of several months, things would happen that were not easily explainable. My folks would come home from work to find the refrigerator door open, food on the counter, faucets running, and even the stove being turned on. What complicated matters was when friends of theirs would visit and stay the night. One in particular, who was stoned all the time, claimed that he would wake up to see the refrigerator door open and food being tossed in the air. Of course, any reasonable person would brush this off as the ramblings of a stoner, but this man swore by it, and he never returned. It's important to note that my mom had several prior paranormal experiences as a child, which I shall tell, and she was still skeptical at this time. My father was raised Catholic, and he of course didn't believe in the paranormal, until it happened to him. One night my mom was in the bathroom, getting ready for bed, while Dad was lying on the bed trying to sleep. All seemed quiet enough, nothing out of the ordinary happening. Then, from out of the blue, Dad heard a series of knocks on the bifold closet door next to the bed. It sounded as though it had come from within the closet, like someone was knocking from the inside of it against the door. This caused Dad to abruptly open his eyes just in time to observe the bifold door slide open, and out came the headless apparition of a woman who looked like she'd turned to see my dad lying on the bed, and then she vanished. Panic-stricken, my dad called for my mom and very sternly said, "We're moving." The Jealous Boy. In the late 1960s, after my mother and her family immigrated here from former West Germany, they moved many times between Mississippi, Louisiana, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Finally, we relocated to where we are now in northern Indiana. They moved several times, even in this state, over a short period of time. There's a quiet small town called Uniondale where the first haunted house was situated. My mother is the oldest of 4 children, and the youngest at the time was still in a stroller. Relevant information for this. When the family moved into a house in rural Uniondale, they were told that a little boy had died recently, and his spirit was alleged to be haunting the home. The children slept upstairs, and there was a room that they were not to enter, so no one went in. The floorboards were so dusty that one could see little footprints of a child who had walked over them. That's the lighter side of the story. The darker side came when the boy's spirit would forcefully shove the children down the stairs, including my aunt, who was still in a stroller. Eventually, the children had to sleep downstairs while the adults slept upstairs in the haunted part of the home. Thankfully, the family had not lived there very long, and I'm sad to say that through my research, the boy's father recently passed away in 2019. The story of a deprived father. From the 1940s to the mid-1960s, there was a very large family in my county who were known for their antics and alcoholism. Raymond was a vet of the Second World War, and he married in the mid-1950s. Together with his wife, they had a daughter. Some years later, in the 1960s, Raymond and his wife split up, but hadn't actually divorced. No official account of why they split up was given, but the story in the newspaper mentioned the split and also made mention that Raymond was saddened and deprived of his daughter. He didn't get to see her much at all. Heartbroken never mixes well with alcoholism, of course. Raymond was an alcoholic, as were his brothers. One day in April of 1968, he was at his brother's house and the two were intoxicated. Their alcoholism was finally mixed with another dangerous element, and that was a loaded weapon. Raymond, in his drunken stupor, pointed up at the ceiling inside the house and shot the weapon off multiple times to his brother's enjoyment. Again, they were intoxicated. The weapon being used was a .22 caliber revolver, and anyone in the firearms hobby would know that the .22 rimfire is not always a reliable round. Sometimes it doesn't go off when the trigger's pulled. You may see where this is going. When the revolver didn't go off, Raymond carelessly tried to look down the muzzle, not knowing it was a hang fire. Suddenly, the cartridge detonated, and Raymond was no longer. In 1970, my mother's family rented the house after the earlier one proved to be too terrifying to live in. The floorboards in the house had a very faint blood stain that began upstairs and ran all the way back down to the back door. One could paint over them, and the stains would later reappear. On Christmas Eve of that year, the family was gathered in the living room downstairs watching the television. The program, I was told, was Art Linkletter, and he was showing off popular toys for Christmas. Suddenly, the family heard a loud and ghastly moan from upstairs, enough to curdle one's blood. The grandfather yelled, and the entire family witnessed something to this day that went down to the very detail. A headless man in flannel stumbled down the stairs into the living room, nearly falling over, then rushed to the living room and out through the back door, where he tripped over the threshold, fell forward, and vanished. Years later, when my mom started dating my dad, she learned that he used to date an old babysitter of theirs. Said babysitter's family actually moved into that home after mom's family left. The babysitter told dad that the house had to be exorcised and they never had the problem again. Incidentally, the house is still infamous for the hauntings in my area. Nearly everyone knows about it, and many still remember what Raymond was like when he was still alive. After all, it really wasn't that long ago.